Yeah. David, I would like to repeat that we are very grateful to you that you have analyzed these difficult texts. It's an issue that is filled with pain and difficult decisions, whether you are in the UK or in Denmark. And I would also like to appreciate your willingness to let the text be central. For of course it's easy to accept remarriage if you take the view that the testimony of the biblical text does not play a decisive role, but it's not the way you argue, and of course it is not, but I would like to mention that we appreciate that very much. I will divide my comment here in two parts. First, some hermeneutical questions, and then I'll discuss some of the texts that you have analyzed. Let me add at the beginning that I have read your books, Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible and in the church, but I have not reacted on your paper here today, but I think there's not very much difference here. And of course it will be a little technical, but the details are important here. Yeah, it's a difficult question, and you see here, my sermon this morning is entitled Divorce and Remarriage Among Christians, and I think that we always all feel that it is really a difficult question. Three comments first on the hermeneutical issues. You emphasize again and again that you want to understand the text as the original audience might perceive the current word of Jesus or the current words of Jesus. You argue in this way again and again, and you do it very convincingly. Of course, in many ways, I fully agree. On the other hand, one might argue that it is the text in its context that is central. A text must be read in its context. For the most part, these two perspectives are not opposed to each other. But they may nevertheless lead in different directions. And let me give an example. A word of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount must, in my view, primarily be interpreted considering the other words in the Sermon on the Mount. You argue that the crucial question is how the audience would understand a statement of Jesus. And yes, of course, I agree that it is important. But I would emphasize that the word of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount must be interpreted primarily in relation to its context in the Sermon on the Mount. And as I understand the Sermon on the Mount, the key question is not how the original audience would understand the word of Jesus, but how each logion of Jesus is related to the other words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. But I'll return to that later on. The second, we have in 1 Corinthians 7 and Romans 7 some words of Paul that are very absolute. He declares that the wife should not separate from her husband. But anyway, Paul adds some instructions if you anyway divorce in 1 Corinthians 7:11. And you have the same when Jesus says that what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Jesus nevertheless allows divorce. So we have absolute statements about this, but we should obviously not interpret them to its face value. And that's a difficult question here. What criteria do we have when we interpret these absolute words? And how do we prevent ending in pure arbitrariness in the interpretation? Jesus forbids divorce, but anyway, he allows divorce. Could you argue in the same way that Jesus forbids remarriage, but anyway, he allows it under certain circumstances? Well, that's a difficult question, and I am not able to answer that in a short paper like this. But I would say that if we have an absolute statement, and it should be qualified in some respect, we need to have some support in the text for qualifying it. I mean that we have to be very cautious here. So we only qualify words that are qualified in the New Testament. Third, it's a difficult challenge to read between the lines. We will understand what it says on the lines only if we understand what is written between the lines. And this is often very difficult because we live in another culture. Something is taken for granted in the text that is not taken. We don't take for granted, and we want to not to over-interpret and not to under-interpret a text. It's a demanding process to interpret in the right way. So we find the right balance between what is written on the lines and what is written between the lines. Yeah. So much for introduction. Then we turn to Deuteronomy 24. It's a peculiar text, this one. And we could ask the question, is it a description of a concrete situation, or is it a law, a commandment, a legislation concerning remarriage? It's not obvious here. It's not totally clear whether we have a description or legislation. One can argue that there is a commandment here. There's no commandment on remarriage in Deuteronomy 24, but the text portrays a concrete situation, and in that situation the aim is to protect the woman against violence. And when this and that happens, then the dignity of the woman should be respected and protected. There's a concrete situation where the text prohibits remarriage. And that's what it says there. If you take the text as a law, then actually it's said there that you are not able to remarry your own woman if you are divorced. It's what's commanded there. So I think that we have to be cautious about this text. There's no commandment here on polygamy or remarriage. It is it is more a description, I think, than legislation. Whether the rabbis interpret it example of this way. Well, the words of Jesus. We have the words of Jesus on this subject in both Mark and Luke. And according to Mark and Luke, Jesus says that whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. The conclusion usually, this conclusion is normally not drawn from Second Temple Judaism, as you have stressed very strongly. Among the Jews, remarriage was very common. Bad was only marriage between a married woman and her lover, while there were also other cases. But Jesus opposes the custom in the contemporary Judaism. Jesus declares that divorce and remarriage are excluded. In Mark and Luke, we have this unrestricted prohibition, and Matthew has the exception for indecency. The most plausible way to argue here must be that we take our starting point in the text from Matthew. The so-called exception of indecency was self-evident to the listeners, as you have pointed out, and therefore Jesus could take it for granted, or at least Mark and Luke could take it for granted that it was the primary question. Mark and Luke must have expected this to be understood. They must have understood it to be implied. But Matthew was more, he was not sure that his listeners would understand it, so he added the words in his text. But it's a peculiar fact here that Mark and Luke could write to a non-Jewish audience and expect this to be understood, while Matthew, writing to a Jewish or a Jewish Christian audience, could not expect this to be understood. That's a peculiar fact. David declares that the words of Jesus on divorce and remarriage are abbreviated down to the minimum and not to be understood as a watertight legal statement. Jesus is, according to Matthew 19, asked whether he agrees with Hillel or Shammai on this text. And the audience will naturally understand the words of Jesus in this way. They know that these exceptions are included in the words of Jesus. So far, David. Well, I will not discuss the relationships between the Gospels here, but now we'll turn to Matthew 19. Jesus says that what God has joined together, man must not separate. Is marriage in principle indissoluble? If two spouses are divorced, do they remain spouses in the eyes of God? Well, it's not easy to answer this question. On the one hand, you could claim that a marriage oath in any case is valid. It's ultimately God who has joined these spouses together to one flesh, so they could not be separated. On the other hand, what we read in Genesis 2 is that is not that a man cannot separate what God has joined together, but as you emphasized, that a man must not do it. And if we see what Jesus says to the Samaritan woman in John 4, I think it's obvious that according to Jesus, it's possible to dissolve a marriage. Jesus says that she has had 5 men, and the man she now has is not her husband. Jesus does not say that she has been married once to one man, and then she later on has lived with 5 men. But he points out that she has been married 5 times and now lives together with someone with whom she is not married. So Jesus takes in this dialogue for granted that the previous marriages have been dissolved. I therefore agree with David that marriage in principle can be dissolved. And so it must also be in the Old Testament. There is a possibility for remarriage in the Old Testament. And of course, if there is a remarriage, then the first marriage must be dissolved. So from the Old Testament we learn that it is a possibility. Well, I'll not mention all the items where we agree, David. I think it's very convincing what we have said about the hardness of hearts, that it's the broken marriage oath that is behind here. But let me mention something about the inception of indecency. We have 2 possibilities in interpreting the word in Matthew 19. You could interpret the text: the one who divorces his wife for any other reason than fornication and marries another commits adultery. Or you could take this to mean the one who divorces his wife and marries another wife for any other reason than fornication commits adultery. This exception of indecency allows either divorce or divorce and remarriage. First of all, the most straightforward and most plausible interpretation of the words of Jesus is that the exception for indecency applies to the word about divorce. Jesus refers to a person who divorces his wife for any other reason than fornication. In my opinion, it's difficult from a linguistic point of view to include the exception of indecency, both divorce and remarriage, in this text. I don't know how you take it exactly. Jesus is talking about divorce which is justified by adultery. And what that is not justified by adultery. Jesus says that if a divorce is related to adultery, then the divorce is valid. So Jesus talks about a valid divorce. And he says that an invalid divorce cannot result in a valid remarriage. If you have an invalid divorce, then you also have an invalid remarriage. But what about the valid divorce? Here, David argues that Jesus permits not only divorce, but remarriage, if the divorce is valid. That will correspond to the Jewish custom, the contemporary Jewish view on remarriage. So it was in Second Temple Judaism. Their marriage was permitted under specific circumstances. Remarriage was permitted under specific circumstances. Consequently, Jesus in some specific cases allows a divorce, and accordingly he also allows remarriage in this case. I ask if this is a plausible conclusion. Does Jesus not in any case prohibit a remarriage? I ask this. I ask why it should be impossible for Jesus to talk about a valid divorce and an invalid remarriage. Why should that be impossible? We read in Matthew 19, he said to them, because of your hardness of heart Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who is able to receive this, receive it. It is interesting that the disciples react with horror at the words of Jesus and says that it's better not to marry. It's surprising that they can be appalled if Jesus is teaching the same as the conservative Pharisees. David answered that the disciples did agree with Hillel in the liberal interpretation of Deuteronomy 24, and they are surprised that Jesus should instead agree with Shammai, basically. The disciples realized that in this case there's only a little possibility of divorce and remarriage. In this situation, it is better not to marry, they argue. Well, this explanation does not convince me. Why should Jesus emphasize that not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given? If in fact he endorses the view of Shammai, it's a very radical statement if the point is that Jesus is in agreement with Shammai instead of Hillel. And Jesus' declaration about the eunuchs belong here. Jesus compares the divorced person with a eunuch. They are similar, Jesus says, because they live as unmarried persons. Why mention this example with the eunuchs exactly here? Accordingly, Jesus talks about a divorced person that lives unmarried, as the eunuchs do. Obviously, it is not an impossibility. The reaction of the disciples and Jesus' subsequent words among the eunuchs show, in my view, that Jesus not only takes the side of Shammai instead of Hillel, but Jesus says something that differs both from Hillel and Shammai. And therefore, the disciples are horrified. And Jesus says later on that only let the one who is able to receive it, receive it. It's so astonishing that Jesus can express himself in that way if he is saying approximately the same as some of the Jews. I therefore ask if the point is that Jesus forbids remarriage. I think that the context here, not so much what the audience would understand, but the context as we have it here, I think that this points in a direction that Jesus forbids remarriage. And how does it appear that the debate here is only about an invalid divorce? I think, I accept that you have given very strong evidence that the Pharisees came with a specific question. But I think that Jesus answers not necessarily in accordance with their position. Mark is writing to a Greek-Roman audience, and he cannot expect the entire Jewish problems to be known among his readers. I think it's remarkable that Mark don't give us any explanation about this. He does not mention that it was a specific discussion between the disciples of 11 and Shammai on valid and invalid divorce. And as he writes to a Greek-Roman audience, I think it's very astonishing that he does not give us this explanation. I'm not convinced that the Jewish relationships were so obvious to the readers of Mark and Luke. And we have to realize that Mark talks about a husband that divorces his wife and a wife that divorces her husband. He talks about both the husband and the wife that take the initiative to divorce. He is obviously talking to a Greek-Roman context. Matthew has only that the husband take this initiative to divorce because he is writing to Jews. But Mark has both man and wife taking this initiative. And in precisely this context, I find it astonishing that Mark would presuppose an awareness of these special Jewish discussions. Well, in my view, it's more likely that Mark did not understand the word of Jesus as a statement of only invalid divorce. And then Matthew 5. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit. But something disappeared here. Commit adultery. Here we have one of the antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus again and again says, "You have heard, but I say." Jesus radicalizes and disregards something that was said to the said earlier, but now Jesus said something that radicalizes it. That was what was said to the ancients, was that the person who divorces his wife shall give her a document of divorce. But now Jesus says something else. These words of Jesus, of course, are puzzling, because how can a divorce force the divorced to commit adultery. You would argue that the reason is that because of the social and economic circumstances, the divorced person will be forced to marry another person, and then there will be adultery. Well, David, you says in that connection that it is an abbreviated text of what is more in detail explained in Matthew chapter 19. And here we have the discussion about the interpretation of Deuteronomy 24 and Hillel's special explanation of that text. And Jesus there says that he is more in agreement with Shammai than Hillel on this issue. I'm not sure that it is so here in the Sermon on the Mount. I would read this text in its context with the antithesis, where Jesus intensifies or even rejects the words that has been told to the ancients. The law of Moses says, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I say. The Mosaic law has some words about swearing, but Jesus says you should not swear. It's told that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say. And in that context, Jesus says, it's said that whoever divorces his wife, let him give a certificate of divorce, but I say to you. As I see it in that context, Jesus is not endorsing the law about certificate of divorce. He is radically different from Hillel and Shammai, in my opinion. He says that something that violates the law of Moses concerning divorce, the divorce document. It's said to them, but now I say to you. That's quite a new situation. The law of Moses is not longer the norm for the disciples. So I think that in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, the conclusion should be that remarriage is invalid. Then we have Paul. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, and if she does, and so on. You take this to mean that Paul is talking about divorce by separation. And of course the word koritzein often means to separate. But you could also translate this text, to the married I give this charge, the wife should not divorce a husband. Why is it so sure that this text concerns the separation and not divorce more general? I think that we need evidence that this text is talking only about the divorce by separation. Well, I would like to explain that more, but time is short, so I just mention that. The next text is 7 verse 12 to 16. Here we have this word about not being enslaved In such cases, the brother and sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Here we have the same problem if the unbelieving partner separates. ESV, NET, if the unbeliever wants a divorce. I think this text is about divorce, but anyway, what is the meaning of the duality here? You are free, but what are you free to do? Are you free to remarry, or are you free to divorce? You are not bound by the marriage with the unbeliever. Well, here you offer very convincing evidence about the situation among the Corinthians, that marriage was remarriage was very common, yet even compulsory. But is that what this text is all about? I'm convinced that at the time of the mainstream opinion was that a valid divorce opens the door to a valid remarriage. But when this is not outspoken by Paul, it is bold and risky to assume that it is presupposed by Paul. I would argue that we should take the words as they appear. And here you mentioned the document of divorce. You are free to marry whoever you want. That this document should be behind what Paul is writing here. Well, you could say that how should the Corinthians be able to see that? They were not Jews, many of them were not Jews at least, but it's not my main point here. You say that it could not be, it should not be understood that you are not bound to the marriage, and then it's said that you have to live as unmarried. Why you say that it is unthinkable that Paul should recommend or even that he should command celibacy here? Well, yes, it was unthinkable perhaps among the Corinthians and in this world. But Paul himself, he says that he would recommend an unmarried situation. He says that to the Corinthians. He says that, okay, I'm not talking to you here as an apostle, but it's my advice that you live as unmarried. So I'm not sure that it is so impossible that Paul should advise the divorced to live as unmarried. Then we have 1 Corinthians 7. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Legarth. Do not seek a wife. Here the main point is the interpretation of this word Legarth. Are you freed from, I don't know if you can say that in English, are you freed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Are you freed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Well, it's about this word Legarth. Does that presuppose that Paul is talking to married people here, and then divorced people? Yes, you could argue there that, and I think it's a strong argument you have here, that Paul actually talks about a divorced person here. Are you divorced from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. Here you have a strong case, I think. On the other hand, Paul is not talking to married people in this context. He is talking to virgins. In your paper you said that you have to be aware that Paul in verse 39 is talking to widows, and we have to realize this. Yes, and we have to realize that here he is talking to virgins. Engaged people, I think you said that it is engaged people here. So what this text is all about is that if you are engaged, if you have a fiancé, then I recommend you not to marry. But if you marry with your fiancé, then you don't sin. I think that's the most obvious way of interpreting this text. It's not about married people, but it's about engaged people. It's saying that virgins being married, they don't sin. It's a peculiar fact. How should people have that impression? But, well, Paul is recommending celibacy in such a strong way that people could perhaps get the impression that they sin when they marry. I have not time to mention chapter 7, verse 39 about the widows, and I also, well, just a few words in Romans 7. She will be called adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. Here we have a very general statement about marriage and divorce, and I think it's very difficult to interpret this text in such a way that it opens for remarriage. I think that we need strong evidence that Paul here talks about an invalid divorce. I miss the evidence for such interpretation. Yeah, I'll finish here. I have been very glad I had the opportunity to study these things through your books, David. And as you see, I have some comments on it, and I think that too much in your argument is based on silence in the texts. Is it justified to assume that Paul and Jesus agrees with the contemporary view on remarriage if they don't explicitly mention it? That's the question here. Can we, from the culture in which they live, conclude that if they do not reject this tradition, then they agree? Or should we say that we must have a word from Paul and Jesus allowing remarriage for accepting remarriage? That's a difficult question, and perhaps that's the point where we differ. I think it's remarkable that Jesus says that Moses, because of the hearts permitted divorce, but he does not say explicitly that Moses, because of the hearts permitted remarriage. In such a situation, you can argue, well, it was presupposed. But I would say, well, but Jesus doesn't say it. Thank you, David, for the opportunity to study these issues. It has been very challenging for me. to reflect once more on these issues, and we agree that the text must be central in this issue, and I hope that we also in the future can continue our conversation and discussion